Growing up, I wasn't a small kid. No, I'm not going to be ashamed to say it. I was fat. Medically, I qualified as obese, and I suffered from some pretty severe depression following my parents' divorce. There was an emptiness in my life when my mom went off and left us, and I filled the void with food. I'm not that person anymore, but I'm not going to be ashamed that I was either. That's the kind of thing that leads down the path that I followed in the first place. And by the time I started high school, I weighed way over 200 pounds and I was very big. I hated gym class and I dreaded the showers even more. It's not like everyone in my grade was some jock or anything like that, but I was by far the biggest boy in freshman year. The only upside to it is that I was a tough little guy as well. The bullies soon gave up on any kind of physical violence against me because I could take it. Shove me against the lockers, I just bounced back. Literally too, I guess. Slap my fat rolls, I had a very high pain threshold. Call me fat? Well, yeah, I knew I was. I could hardly deny it. I didn't love hearing it, but just pointing out that I was a big boy only stung internally. And so yeah, I was bullied and it did upset me, but I was great at not showing it, and I think a lot of the kids respected that. There was one kid though. His name was Neil, and he was as skinny as I was fat. Now, I was pretty short for my age, but he was a whole head shorter than me, a really tiny guy, but he wasn't some adorable little shorty. Neil was a mean one, and no mistake. You could tell from the glint in his eye and the perpetual smirk on his face. And rumor had it that Neil could be such a bully that he once made a senior guy cry. Nobody really seemed to know exactly how Neil was a bully. Kids just knew to be wary of him and keep away from him, and this resulted in a couple of things. One, Neil had no friends. Nobody wanted to actually spend time with him because he was so unpredictable and supposedly volatile. Now sure, people would be polite to him and nod hello in the halls, but nobody wanted to sit with him at lunch or invite him to social events or anything like that. And two, it meant that some of the more physical bullies had it in mind to take Neil down. And that's where I came in. One day I was sitting alone eating lunch in the courtyard because, like Neil, I also didn't have any actual friends. And so who should come and sit beside me but Neil himself? He asked if I wanted half of his sandwich, and to be honest, it did look really delicious. I really didn't know what to do. Neil, this famous idiot, was offering me food. Was there some catch to it? Like it was filled with razor blades or something? In the end, I decided that I was more scared of what would happen if I said no, so I took the sandwich. And this seemed to make Neil happy, and even more so when I actually ate it. I didn't really know what to say after that, so I just sort of asked him if he was having a good day. Neil ignored my question and told me that he had a proposal for me. Neil basically proposed that I act as his bodyguard, and in exchange, he'd make sure that I wasn't the target of bullies. I told him I wasn't really bullied anymore these days, and he grinned, that sort of snide grin that he had, and pointed out that this was because he had left me alone so far. It was a good point. Neil had never bullied me, and I wasn't sure that I wanted to find out what would happen if he did. And so I agreed to be his friend and bodyguard, and this arrangement somehow lasted all the way to junior year. Neil used me to cause all kinds of trouble. He'd pick on certain kids, really vile stuff, and then have me threaten to fight them, or in most cases, take any blows that would have been aimed at him. Sometimes he'd force me to beat up younger kids, younger than myself, as we got older. In junior year in particular, we saw a few freshman targets that Neil took great delight in having me hurt. Now you may be wondering how Neil managed to have such a hold over me, especially since I wasn't that particularly thin-skinned. Well, Neil managed to find that chink in my armor, my mom. Anytime I tried to push back against Neil or deny him, then he'd throw a barb my way about how my mother had left because of her disgusting fat son and her autistic daughter and her fat arsler husband. Neil also seemed to know pretty intimate details of the man my mother had run off with and what she was doing now. When I asked Dad about this, he got really quiet and just sort of asked me who I'd heard this from, which was all the answer I needed. Neil was able to use my mother against me quite often, and that hurt. It really hurt. And so I took the path of the coward. I chose to hurt other people instead of letting Neil hurt me. And I know this makes me a bad person. I regret all of it. but it is what it is now. And like I said, I'm going to call things as they are, although in this case, yes, I am ashamed of who I was. Neil's influence over me almost ruined my high school career as well. My report cards went steadily downhill. Dad never punished me, he just got kind of sad. One time, he was a little bit drunk and he asked where he was going wrong with me and what he could do to help me to get back on track. And it just about broke my heart. And instead of facing up to that, I said something incredibly mean to him that I still apologize for to this day. I told him he could stop being such an embarrassing loser. Now meanwhile, I developed a reputation at school for being a bully and someone to avoid, so Neil was my only friend really for years. And somehow, Neil managed to twist things so it looked like I was the ringleader and he was my sidekick, so any trouble we got into, it was usually me who took the brunt of it. I remember one time, Neil persuaded me to scratch up the paint on the car belonging to one of the most popular seniors in school. If this guy had caught me, I think he was one of the few people in the school who would actually outdo me in a fight, and he would have pummeled me into the ground. Thankfully, we got away with that one. Towards the end of junior year, Neil developed a crush. The girl in question was an unassuming, bookish girl who was quiet and kept to herself. You know the type. Now, she was also the girl that I'd had a crush on for the last year as well, and I'm pretty sure that Neil knew this. Neil told me that he had a plan to ask her to date him. He just needed some time with her in the art classroom, and I had to stand guard to make sure nobody came along and unlocked the door. Now, I might have been a dumb kid, but I wasn't stupid. I knew that there was absolutely nothing good about what Neil might have planned, and so this one time, I said no. And Neil went nuts. Apparently, there were a lot of things that he'd been holding back, things that he knew about my mom, and according to him anyway, how my stepdad had been abusing my sister. And then he had all this evidence on his phone of my involvement and all the bullying, cut and edited in a way that looked like I was the sole culprit. In particular, there was minutes of footage of me vandalizing the senior's car. Neil threatened to reveal this to them and to reveal to the whole school the kind of loose woman my mother was and how she was allegedly pimping out her own daughter. And at that moment, I saw red. By this point, a lot of my fat had turned into muscle and I had a huge growth spurt. Neil was still tiny. I picked my bully up by the waist. I slammed him down on a table into the empty classroom we were conspiring in. And the crack I heard was almost as terrifying as Neil's screams. I knew I'd done something really, really terrible, something even Neil didn't deserve. And when it all came out, I didn't protect Neil, but I didn't try to protect myself either. I deserved a lot of the blame and I wanted to take it. After this, being sent to a military academy was my own choice. I'd scared myself stupid with my own rage, and I'd hurt people and I'd gotten out of control. Neil's family wanted to press charges, and the military academy also served as a compromise. And this is also how I found out that the man my mother had left the family for was Neil's father. This whole time, my new stepdad was Neil's biological dad who walked out on Neil's family when Neil was just a baby. And I can only guess that the whole thing was intended as some sort of roundabout revenge against me in the end. Military school was the making of me, really. And I took it like a duck to water. I graduated and then joined the military, where I'd stay there to this day. I hate the person I used to be, but I'm proud of the person I've become. And I heard that Neil took a very darker path and never tried to better himself. To a larger extent, I blame myself for this. I certainly see him as a victim in many circumstances. I try to make up for who I was every day. I serve our country, I donate to charity, I send money back to my dad to help my sister's care. Thankfully, Neil's claims of abuse towards my sister were lies aimed to disgrace his dad. Apparently, he's not even that bad of a guy. I don't want to know him, though. I just want to keep making amends for allowing one of the most effed up people I've ever known to dictate, dominate, and destroy my childhood. You may finish this story by hating me and thinking I'm a terrible person, and I wouldn't blame you, but I'm trying. I wish Neil had done the same, and from what I understand, he's done some pretty terrible things in the years since I've known him, and I can only hope that one day he takes his first steps onto the road to redemption that I'm attempting to walk myself. You can't take back the things you do, but you can try and make amends for them, even if it's too little and too late. was younger, in high school, I admit that I was a bit of a stoner, a sort of emo goth type who probably didn't take care of herself that well and smoked a little too much weed. Now, this was before weed was legal too, so we couldn't just walk to the store and pick some up. We'd spend our weekends hanging out in this sort of cubby hole under a bridge, not like the one from that famous dancing video you probably remember, and we'd turn it into a bit of a hangout space. Rugs, magazines, a battery-powered stereo, the works. Now, one rule was if you showed up, then you brought snacks. And there was one guy who didn't follow that rule, or any of them really, and his name was Birmingham. And that wasn't really his real name. I imagine that, but that's what he insisted we call him. Because get this, he'd been to Birmingham in England once on a vacation for like a month. And there were a bunch of ways Birmingham didn't fit in. He wasn't a goth or emo, he was more of a hippie. And he was this white dude with dreadlocks, although I'm not sure if they were dreads or whether his hair was really just that unkempt. Birmingham would never arrive with snacks either, and he'd never contribute free stuff to the den. He'd just stroll in and hang out while the rest of us put the work in. And while some of us might not have the best kind of hygiene, Birmingham had absolutely reeked of BO. And whoever got stuck sitting next to him, usually one of the girls, would have to develop a tolerance to his smell. Oh, and did I mention that Birmingham was 32? A 32-year-old stinking hippie hanging out with high school goths and emos, and he was not shy about hitting on some of the girls in the group. So, you're probably asking, why did we tolerate him? And the answer was simple. We were young, dumb, and he would buy us alcohol and provide us with weed. For a price, mind you, which he made no secret about skimming a profit from. He'd just shown up one day, told us that he could hook us up just as we'd been wondering how the hell to get into substance abuse. Spoiler, just don't. And he sort of just stuck around ever since. And so Birmingham, despite all of his flaws and age gap and being a creep, was very much always at our hangout. He acted like he was the king of the castle and we were his adoring servants, especially the women. Even though all of us resisted his quote-unquote charms, he behaved as if we constantly lusted after his stinky-ass body. He was gross, to put it mildly, and we were dumb enough to let him stick around anyways. And there were maybe 8 of us, including Birmingham, on and off, 4 girls, 3 high school guys, and this Birmingham guy. 2 of the guys were far too of losers to really ever stand up against him, and one of them was as much of a predator creep as Birmingham was. So between Birmingham and this other weirdo, whose name was Josh, us girls really had to watch ourselves. We just moved into junior year when Birmingham ramped up his behavior. He singled out a couple of the girls, they were named Sandy and Bridget, and started trying to get them to engage in some really strange actions with him. At first, he offered free joints in exchange for this, and then it was an entire free baggie of weed, and then it was weed and unspecified pills. He must have been really desperate to get touched, as that's all he was aiming for, to start with anyway. And a rumor went around that Sandy did actually give in and even did some strange stuff with him for a bag of weed, and we didn't see her for about a week. And when she came back to the group, she seemed down and ashamed and wouldn't look anyone in the eye, and we got the impression that whatever experience she'd had with him had not been a good one. And knowing how pressurizing Birmingham could get, I could only imagine. Now, none of us wanted to bring it up with Sandy in case it wasn't that, but behind her back, most of the boys were not sympathetic, especially Josh, while obviously the girls felt bad for her. And we began talking about how to get rid of this Birmingham, but the boys were having none of it. He was our free ticket to weed and alcohol, and we weren't losing that just because Sandy wanted a freebie. These little assholes. I'm not going to pretend Sandy was innocent in this whole affair, but if you knew Birmingham, you'd know how far he'd tried to go to get what he wanted. And the fact that it had taken until now was a miracle. The thing that changed everything was when this new girl joined junior year and quickly became a member of our group. Her name was Summer, and ironically, she had almost jet black hair, completely natural, and she soon became one of us, and Birmingham was smitten, and so was Josh. This was the first rift. Summer was one of those girls who was confident and she dressed provocatively, but she had no interest in doing anything with a dude, and so began a competition between Josh and Birmingham to be the first one to get Summer without clothes. They weren't trying to sleep with her, not yet anyway. They just made a bet to be the first one to consensually see her, and the consensual part wasn't out of respect or anything, it was just for bragging rights between these two weirdos. Naturally, Summer didn't appreciate this from the start, having two guys, one of whom was literally 32 and stank, trying to get her to do something like flashing, and she began asking some of us privately why we tolerated this weirdo, and so we explained. And then she asked why we tolerated Josh, and we started realizing that there really wasn't actually a good reason for that. He was a creepy idiot too, but he normally targeted girls outside the group. There were all sorts of rumors circulating about the way he'd treated past girlfriends. Summer decided she'd try to handle it, and her solution was to offer some kind of vague incentive to Josh or Birmingham, to whichever one beat the other in a fight. And very clearly beat, no question that they'd won. I.e., she meant one of them to put the other in the hospital. Summer had expected them to say no, that it wasn't worth it, but apparently this high school boy and this 32-year-old man were willing to risk killing each other over seeing some girl's body, and so it was decided that the fight would be that Friday night. Summer had become my personal best friend, really, so she was panicking to me on the telephone about this. And of course she didn't want anyone to get hurt, she just wanted both of them to just screw off. We couldn't think of any solutions other than to try and de-escalate the fight or call the cops if we really had to. And ultimately, none of that needed to happen. We all showed up to the hangout on Friday. Birmingham made some disgusting crude comment about how he was going to win the fight and Summer would be compelled to do all sorts of unspeakable things. And that's when he attacked. Only the attack didn't come from Josh. Now remember I said the other two guys who were too much of babies to ever stand up against Birmingham? Well, it turns out that wasn't true. One of them, a guy named Craig, suddenly went flying across the room, slamming Birmingham against the concrete wall of the hangout and pinning him there by the throat. Craig was a big guy, tall and large, and he had no problem holding this skinny, wiry Birmingham guy in place. And it all came out. How much we all hated Birmingham, and how he was a stinking, vile parasite who could only get with women by trying to bribe children with drugs. How none of us could stand him, basically everything we'd ever wanted to say to him. You see, we found out later that Craig had been developing a burning, powerful crush on Summer, and the more Birmingham and Josh talked about her like that, the more quietly and fuming he got. And then he just snapped. We watched in silent awe as Craig headbutted Birmingham square in his nose, audibly breaking it, and we listened as he threatened to gut him violently if he ever showed his face around the hangout again, or even around town. And then he pulled the hunting knife out of his belt. That's the exact moment Josh walked in, looking sick and nervous, presumably for his fight. You'd expect this to distract Craig, but it didn't. He held the knife up to Birmingham's throat so tightly that it drew beads of blood and told him how serious he truly was. And then Craig dropped some info we didn't know. He mentioned the name of his family, a well-known Irish-American gang in town who were, to say the least, serious business. And when Birmingham heard that, that's what finally broke him. He began to cry, begging forgiveness and apologizing to Craig. And Craig said it wasn't him who deserved the apology, it was Summer. And Summer just shook her head and said she didn't care, she just wanted this guy out of there. So Craig let him limp away, and that was the last we ever saw of that creepy drug dealer again. Now meanwhile, Josh had been watching the whole thing with a sort of sick look on his face, as I said, and Craig turned to him, tucked the knife back into his belt, and just gave him this look that sort of said, "You could be next." And the group kind of dissipated after that. Nobody really had the energy to hang out with each other with all that violence hanging in the air, and Summer and I stayed friends, and the other girls and guys sort of drifted away. We're still friends to this day, and sometimes Summer and I talk about how we were regularly hanging out with 3 different guys who were scary in their own way. And there was Josh, who I later found out got kicked out of college for his conduct with a female student. And then there was Birmingham, who, looking back, was more terrifying than I truly realized. An adult male trying to use intoxicants to get underage women into bed with him. And while he was maybe the least dangerous, Craig was definitely the scariest. Nothing suggested he'd explode that day, and nothing gave away that he was the black sheep of an extremely violent family. And all we can be grateful for is that Craig's first outburst of rage was directed at the right target. When I was growing up during high school, we had a quiet kid in class. You know the type that I'm talking about. This was post-Columbine, so quiet kid jokes were told, but kind of in a whispered tone. Nobody wanted to actually trigger the quiet kid or generally cause anything really bad to happen, and Kenny never actually showed serious signs of violence. Well, mostly anyway. Occasionally some of the cool kids would give him crap and he'd lash out and sort of yell at them. And whenever he got angry, his voice became incomprehensible, which really didn't help with people calling him an R-word or slow or a prospective danger to society. Now, a few things about Kenny that were actually true. His mom cut his hair in a bowl cut, and the 2000s you'd think that she'd absolutely have to know that this was going to bring the wrath of 1,000 high schoolers down on him. And he also carried a Spider-Man backpack at all times, one from the animated series, and it was before people thought things like this were retro and cool, and so that was another reason people dunked on poor Kenny. He could barely communicate if you spoke to him. He'd spend so long thinking about what you said that it felt like he was almost ignoring you, and you had to learn to just stand there and wait, and eventually Kenny would reply. Most times anyway. Sometimes he really would just zone out, and you'd have to sort of yell his name to snap him back to attention. Now looking back, Kenny shouldn't really have been in school with regular kids, or if he was, he should have had some kind of helper or something. And instead, this probably autistic, probably mentally ill kid was just left to fend for himself in the Thunderdome that is high school. I was so relieved when the new kid, Bradley, joined the school, and he was one of those tall, blonde, wholesome American boys who got along well with pretty much everybody. He excelled at sports, he was smart, the works, and I might have been a little jealous, I gotta admit. And so Bradley became friends with basically everyone in no time, but of all the people he hung around the most, it was Kenny. And I guess you could say that he took him under his wing, but it didn't feel patronizing or protective or anything like that. He really brought Kenny out of his shell. It turns out that when he wasn't ostracized and constantly made fun of, Kenny was actually pretty funny, pretty smart guy. He was deeply intelligent and he was an absolute whiz at chess, and so was Bradley. And Bradley slowly integrated Kenny into various friendship groups. And for his part, Kenny, shockingly, integrated right back. And it was like this strange, unique, beautiful kid had been waiting beneath the surface for someone like Bradley to evolve him, and it was absolutely, utterly tragic that it just couldn't last. Now one day, I came in a little too late to school because I didn't have class first period, and as soon as I got there, I could tell some commotion was going on. Cops were there, and it looked like they were searching lockers, Kenny's locker in particular. I watched as they bagged something up and removed it from the premises, and shortly after that, a sniffling, crying Kenny was marched down the corridor in handcuffs. Now here's the story we were told. Bradley, as his best friend, had discovered that Kenny was planning to dose the food in the school cafeteria with some type of poison. This plan had been underway since well before Bradley joined the school, but instead of making the most of his newfound popularity, Kenny decided to go ahead with it anyway. Bradley had seen the poison in Kenny's locker and, despite his friendship with Kenny, couldn't let this slide and reported it to the school. One kid's dad was high up in the force and kind of snuck a look at the notes on the investigation, and it looked like they didn't have much on Kenny. He was claiming he didn't even know what that substance was. And then Bradley found the manifesto. It had been hidden behind a false wall in Kenny's locker that he had, and Bradley had somehow dug it out, and it detailed Kenny's plan to poison the food and how on the same day he was going to bring 3 pistols to school belonging to his dad and finish anyone off that way. Bradley brought this manifesto straight to the dean, and I guess he really hadn't thought this through. 1, why was Bradley able to access Kenny's locker, find that wall, and discover this manifesto when the cops didn't? 2, Kenny's dad had died many years ago, and while that didn't rule out the idea of him owning guns, he had been a staunch anti-gun campaigner, so the idea of Kenny accessing his father's guns seemed ridiculous. 3, the manifesto was supposedly written before Bradley even came to the school, but the food that Kenny claimed he was going to poison had not been on the menu until that year. Naturally, this made the school authorities and the cops suspicious. Kenny had been suspended from school at the time since there was no actual proof he planned on committing a crime, and then the next thing we knew, Bradley was no longer in attendance either. It turns out Brad was a psychopath who had been kicked out of his last school for antisocial behavior. His father owned an exterminator firm that specialized in killing rats. One of the few remaining uses of that poison is in rat poison. Kenny would not have been able to get his hands on that type of stuff easily. Bradley would have. And eventually, with warrants served, the cops were able to prove that bottles of this stuff were missing from Bradley's dad's inventory. And not only that, they were able to get access to the family computer, and what they found was very damning. A saved file containing the whole manifesto. According to the kid, whose dad was one of the lead detectives, Bradley broke down and sang like a canary. Not a remorseful one, but a proud one. When he arrived at the school and first saw Kenny and heard the quiet kid jokes, he was curious. He wanted to know what kind of punishment would be dealt out to someone who might be a school-based criminal, and he was curious about the effect it'd have on Kenny. Rumor has it that when asked, Bradley coldly admitted that he was curious if Kenny would commit some kind of act against himself. You know what I mean? I don't know exactly what happened to Bradley. He was expelled, but I'm not sure what kind of criminal charges were brought against him. His father doubled down on the misplaced poison having nothing to do with his son, and so we never saw Bradley again. And we never saw Kenny either. The whole incident broke him, and I wish I could say that he'd overcome his experiences, returned to school, and been embraced by us again. I know we would have welcomed him back, but Bradley broke him. Kenny spent the rest of his high school career in some kind of mental institute, and for all I know, he's still there. I've tried to find him a few times, but I've never been successful. And on the chance that you're living your best life, Kenny, and also somehow hear this, I wish you the best. Bradley, you seem to be a psychopath, and I hope you ended up locked away for the safety of everyone. Spending my teenage years around someone like you was the most chilling and horrific thing possible, and the way you tortured poor Kenny is unforgivable. Adults can be awful, but kids can be truly, truly evil.